All right, folks, it's time for Lana and Steve to join us on stage. Welcome. Lana currently works for Trovio in Sydney, and they are developing a blockchain-based system for managing carbon credits. And Steve currently works for SUSE. They're a German-based multinational open-source software company that develops and sells Linux products to business customers. So their talk is all about getting rejected. You might have gotten turned down after an interview or told you can't have a promotion or even fired. Rejection has happened to everyone, and it's one of the realities of late-stage capitalism. We'll hear some real-life stories about rejection, the kinds of things you should and shouldn't do after being rejected, and explore a few strategies for getting back on that workhorse once again. Steve and Lana both drive electric vehicles. Steve has a Tesla and Lana has a Mini, but the Mini only has a very short range of around 150 kilometres. But somehow that hasn't stopped her taking it back and forth between Brisbane and Sydney. So given that's about, for those folks who aren't local Australians, it's about a 1,000 kilometre journey. You might just want to have a little chat to Lana about EV range anxiety during the breaks. But for now, please welcome Lana and Steve.
Okay. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of Naarm, the land on which we are giving this presentation today, and the traditional owners of Gadigal land, where we live, work and wrote this talk. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here today. We would also like to acknowledge that this land, which we benefit from occupying, was stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. We would also like to apologise to Gloria Gaynor specifically, and to anyone who's here and who lived through disco. However, we will not apologise for our overuse of disco imagery in this talk.
So, getting rejected by a company can be terrifying, upsetting, or just plain annoying. And then there's a range of different ways they can reject us too. The most common way is during the interview process. You might apply for a job you know you'd be great at, only to never hear back from them, so they've ghosted you. Or you might apply, get a phone interview, an interview or two, and then bam, they like someone else better. You could even get all the way through the interview process, already planning out your commute, you're planning your budget, buying nice new outfits for the office, and then you get the phone call saying they've chosen the other candidate, or they're withdrawing the position entirely.
But there are other ways that they can reject us too. What about when you're looking out for that promotion but just can't seem to clinch it? Or when you really want to work on that fancy new project but you get stuck with the old boring one instead? And there's also the one that feels like just all too common right now. It's when you've been happily working for a company for months or even years, when you get the word they're downsizing and your job is one of the ones that no longer exists.
Whichever way you slice it, and whatever form it takes, getting rejected by anyone is horrible. When you rely on a company not only for your livelihood, but in many cases a large part of your social life, not to mention the 40 hours or more you're spending there every week, it can be especially difficult to handle. So let's start with the big one, getting laid off.
Getting laid off is never fun, but if you've been in the IT industry for a while, there's a reasonable chance that you've had it happen to you at some point, and in some cases you might have had it happen more than once. Even if you've read the writing on the wall and you think that layoffs might be coming soon, you never really know if they will, how big they'll be, if it'll be you, your manager, your teammates, or just how good or terrible your company's going to handle it all. And even if you make it through a round of layoffs unscathed, you might experience survivor's guilt. And there's always that lingering feeling that there might be another round anytime now. So neither of us are psychologists, I'll point out, but we have been rejected a lot. So from our non-specialist perspective, there are a few things you can do to make yourself feel better in the short, medium and long term.
In the short term, feel free to experience all the emotions. This is mostly applicable to the really big rejections, like being fired, but can apply to those smaller ones too. Have a cry, have a shout, stomp your feet, rage, rail against the unfairness of the company, your boss, the system, late-stage capitalism, all those things. All of these things are reasonable to be upset about. And you should be. And your psychologist or doctor won't recommend this, but we strongly believe in going out and having a few drinks, if that's your thing. Maybe some tacos, because tacos are delicious. And if you know of people who've recently experienced the same thing, because a whole bunch of you have been laid off at the same time, then maybe you should absolutely head to the pub with them and blow off some steam. And it's really tempting, especially if you've got some financial pressures involved, to just start madly applying for jobs right away. But that's a really good way to make some poor life decisions. So the main thing to remember is that you don't need to get right back on the horse. Give it a few days or a week. Allow yourself to wallow. Feel those feelings. Go for a bike ride. Sit and read. Get some stuff done around the house you've been putting off. Call your mum. All the things you wanted to do. Now's your chance.
So, our first story. If you've been laid off before, you know that there's a little feeling in the air before it all happens. So I'm sure it will surprise none of you to know that I had been doing some interviews in the months before I got laid off most recently. In fact, only the week before I was laid off, I had declined a job offer for a company I actually really wanted to work for because they couldn't match my salary expectations. So I was fired late on a Wednesday afternoon, and about 10 minutes to 5 on that Wednesday afternoon, I emailed the recruiter from that job back with the intention of getting him on the phone and asking to be reconsidered, because I was going to take that lower pay now that I was facing the prospect of no pay at all. So I actually don't know whether fate intervened or whether that recruiter just wanted to have, to avoid having a weepy woman who'd just been fired on the phone. Which is fair, but it was all for the best. He never called me back.
Ever,
not once. Taking a week or so off from the job search was exactly what I needed. And when I did start interviewing and negotiating again, I could actually be a whole lot more rational and be able to hold out for a job that would pay me what I needed to be earning, rather than sort of running straight into the first job I found and running my budget into the red every month, which would have been so much more damaging in the long term.
in the medium term, once the initial shock has worn off, it can be a good idea to take stock of things before you just leap back into that job market. There was a great thread on the Right to Doc Slack about this recently, so we've shamelessly I've stolen some ideas from there. The first one is to have a think about what you want from your working life. Think about what you value, what you did like, what you didn't like about your previous roles, and the things that you might want to learn more about or work more on. This will help you guide you in your job search, but also think about ways you could learn new skills or pivot into a different role, switch to part-time or contracting, or give up your job altogether and become a potato farmer. That's fine too. And if that's what you need to do right now, you should absolutely do that. Also, now is the time to start working your networks a little bit. Don't go too hard. It'll put people off, but start putting those feelers out and let people know that you are actively looking for work. And then if you've got friends that are working where you'd like to work, reach out to them or buy them a coffee. In this industry, the best way to get a job is through networking. So now is the time to start making sure you're reaching out.
Now for the long term. If it's taken you a while to find a job, it is really easy to start feeling panicky, especially if you're watching your bank account slowly or quickly dwindle. In this case, it is perfectly normal to start wanting to make some rash decisions. Where a few months ago, the idea of sort of giving it all in might have felt like a truly terrible idea, maybe now you're starting to think that potato farming is actually where you need to be. And it might be. It's still okay to change your mind, but don't do it just because you're panicking. This is where you need to go back to all those things you considered in the first few weeks. What's important to you, what isn't. And if potato farming actually does tick those boxes, then go for it. Otherwise, you might want to keep on plugging with the applications. Feel free to have a week or so off every so often if you need to just take a moment away from all the rejection and all the ghosting as well. But decide ahead of time how long you'll take and make sure you get back to it afterwards. If you do decide that you need to pick up a side hustle of some description, so you might go into retail work or drive for Uber or whatever, don't think of that as an admission of failure. It's just you doing what you need to do to get by until your next big thing comes along. Because one thing I can assure you is that the money train doesn't run to a schedule.
So this is a story from Lana. So she's been laid off twice. And the first time it took her about 8 months to get another job. And the second time it took a few weeks. And it's not like she magically became better at job interviews or better at a job, or became a totally different person between those two events. Based on the sample size of 2, I think we can safely assume that the job market and the people who do the hiring are very fickle.
So what happens if you've gone through the process of being rejected, only for the one who rejected you to turn around and ask for you back? This can happen in a few different scenarios. Either you got rejected through the interview process and then re-interviewed with them again at a later date, either for the same role or a different role. Or you might have gotten laid off and then they've asked to rehire you later on, possibly as a contractor, or like at a different pay rate or in a different role to the one you used to hold.
If you were rejected for a role during the interview process and you find yourself interviewing for the same company again, presumably you still want to work for them. Make sure that when you interview the second time around, that you make it clear why you're just not a great fit for the position that you're applying for, as you would in any interview situation, but why this role is better for you than the other one that they've rejected you from. Or, if it's the same role, why you're better suited to the role now than when you were when they rejected you the first time around. Perhaps you've grown your skills, learned some important lessons, or it could be something more practical, like you've moved closer to where the office is. And if you got any feedback as to why you were rejected the first time, make certain you address it directly.
If you have previously worked for a company and now they want you to come back, then you really need to think critically about how you feel about them. Did you enjoy working for them? Would you have the same manager as before? And if so, how did you get along with them? Don't just consider how things used to be, though. Consider what might have happened in the meantime as well. How has the company changed? Have their priorities shifted? If you still know people who work there or who worked there more recently than you, reach out to them and have a frank conversation about things. Another important consideration if you're part of a mass layoff is to consider how that layoff affected things as well. Did people get disgruntled and leave even if they weren't laid off directly? How do people feel about the company prospects since then?
From a business perspective, if they've just laid off a bunch of people and now they're hiring those same roles back as contracting positions, that's a little bit of a red flag. The bonus is, of course, if you do decide to come back and contract, you can walk away into the sunset if things get too nasty and on fire.
So this story came from the community, and it came from a tech writing veteran who finds the entire recruitment process very amusing. That was the name they gave me. In a funny incident, I was rejected by the senior tech writing manager for a permanent role because they thought I didn't have relevant writing skills, but was hired in the same company on a contract next week on another team where I spent the next 2 years. Ended up working with the same tech writing manager on a couple of documentation deliverables, and they commended me on my professionalism and writing skills. LOL.
If you do decide to laugh in their faces when you ask them back, try to do it in the politest way possible. It's really tempting to reply back with, "Oh, hell no." But even if you have no intention of ever working for the company again, you just don't know where those people are going to pop up again.
So in this story, I was a manager at a company. I had a particularly difficult employee, and we eventually came to an agreement that him working somewhere else was going to be best for everybody. So many years later, I was a manager at a different company and was hiring for staff, and along my desk came a resume with a very familiar name on it, and a strange gap in his work experience for the years where we used to work together. So I have no idea if he didn't realise I was the same person or if he thought he would just trick me by leaving it off his resume, but either way, he didn't get hired.
So we've talked a little bit about layoffs, but there's one thing you're almost guaranteed to be doing a lot of when you're laid off, and that is interviewing. Unfortunately, that is also something that is likely to generate a bunch of rejections. Being rejected through the application and the interview process happens a lot, especially in this industry. It's also really easy to get way more emotionally invested in these rejections than you really should. And then when you're absolutely devastated over a rejection you just got, tell yourself you're overreacting. Someone else has been going through worse, people have been unemployed for longer, or they deserve the position more. And this kind of thing is usually just your own hindbrain talking, and it's wrong, like it is about everything as well.
So the place where you're most likely to get rejected during the interview process is at the first step. When you submit your resume to a company, the first thing you need to do is get past whatever automated system they're using. It's referred to as ATS, or an applicant tracking system. So the good news is that this is about outsmarting robots, and you are all way smarter than the robots. So the reason companies use ATS for the first pass is because they get hundreds or even thousands of resumes for each application, and it's just not worth the humans' time to go through them all. ATS, at its most basic, will look at the format of your resume and will match on keywords. So as much as you might want to do something a bit different to stand out, it will probably fail ATS and get you kicked out of the process. Always keep that stuff for when you know you're going to be dealing with a human and not a robot. So if you get a rejection at this stage, you'll probably get an automated email, and it'll probably be within minutes or hours of putting in your resume. That's how you know you failed ATS.
So to get around this, there are a few different tools out there that you can use to review your resume for whether or not you'll pass ATS. And most of them have a free trial period. But if you can, we'd recommend ponying up for the cash just to get the most out of the tool. So it's worth putting in the time to check your generic resume that you send out to everyone to make sure that it won't get kicked out by ATS. And then when you're applying for those jobs that you really want, and you put in the time to polish it up and write a cover letter, make sure that you upload the ad as well as your resume and the cover letter to make sure that they match. And that it won't guarantee you a screening call, but it's a much better way to get you through that so you don't fall at the first hurdle. And so, of course, one of the other ways is to just sidestep ATS completely and get a referral from someone who already works at the company. So before you apply, check with your network a bit to see if someone works there and see if you can slide in through the side door. LinkedIn is really handy here if you do use it.
So this story comes from a Write the Docs community member. They applied for a job at a company we shall refer to as Boggle. They went through a recruiter screen, submitted a portfolio, did an initial interview, didn't hear back for 4 months, not a peep. Finally got a rejection by email at that point and thought, good riddance. Then saw a bunch of people they saw got hired by Boggle around the same time get laid off. Felt bad for them, but glad that it hadn't worked out.
The second stage is the recruiter screen. Now, these can be trickier than it seems, but it's important to remember what it's actually all about. First of all, it's for the recruiter to find out if you are really who your resume says you are. Always make sure you have your resume open in front of you when you take these calls, because then you can make sure you're getting your dates right, using the same words, various skills and technology, and you're not going to accidentally mix up job titles or dates, because this throws up a massive red flag. The second main thing is for you to get a sense of the job and the company. The problem here, of course, is that you're speaking to someone who's had the job you're applying for, unless you're applying to be a recruiter, I guess. They've had the job described to them, possibly terribly. So now is not the time for technical questions, like what tool chain or platforms are they using or what style of agile. They're unlikely to be able to tell you, and it might just make them feel like a bit of an idiot, and you want them to feel good about talking to you. So the questions you should be asking are more along the lines about company culture, what you'd be working on, what team, what product you might be working on, and whether it's a remote or a hybrid role.
The thing you really want to get from this call is an idea of what happens next. So what interviews you're going to be going through and who you'll be talking to, and also how long everything might take. If you fail at this step, take heart. It's probably because you didn't match the specific skill set that they're after, or you don't have the right education or training. If you do get a chance to ask for feedback, find out where those gaps are. The other good thing about a recruiter screen is it's actually a good point for you to decide whether or not you want to reject them as well. Now is a really good time to bow out of the process if the company or the role doesn't seem like a good fit. And most recruiters are fairly happy to remove you from the candidate pool before they start wrangling people to interview you, if you really aren't interested.
So this story comes from Anonymous, and here's what they said. I've been ghosted by numerous companies in the middle of the interview process. At the end of a second interview with 2 higher-ups, one of the interviewers said, our recruiter will reach out to you to set up another call so you can meet the entire team. Or not. I never heard from them again, ever. Experiences like this make me really question my own sanity.
The next few interviews can come in just about any order, but we're going to look at the technical interview next. This one can be really tricky to nail, and you'll need to make sure you're prepared for it. With any luck, you'll be given some kind of idea about what they want you to do or discuss, and depending on the role and the company, there might be some kind of take-home or homework component that you'll be given a few days before, and you should be told how long you should take to spend on it. So the biggest piece of advice we can give you on this one is to make sure you prepare. If you have a task, do it. Make sure you follow instructions to the letter. Make copious notes as you go. Things like the order you tackled things in, your reasoning at every step, whenever you changed your mind about your approach, or when you consulted external sources. If it's a live challenge, then you need to make sure you're doing this out loud instead, and that's tricky. The point is what they're trying to see how you approach problems, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but there really is no right or wrong answers for this bit.
Now, if you get rejected at this stage, it could be for any number of different reasons. You might have proven your skills just weren't aligned with what they need. So in that case, you probably wouldn't have succeeded at the role. But assuming they're looking for the right skills, or maybe you made a mistake on the day. Preparing ahead of time and reviewing the core skills you'll be tested on will help you avoid the mistakes. But if you don't have the right skills, there's nothing really you can do except for try to learn them. The other reason you might fail at this stage is because you revealed something about yourself that didn't quite agree with the interviewer. Perhaps you disparaged a tool or language that they really like, or something that you brought up that they felt wouldn't gel with the team or themselves. So it's really good idea to stay polite, be considerate, and don't go bagging off other people or technologies. It's a good rule all the time, but in technical interviews especially.
So this is my story. I was applying for a role as technical writer with a relatively large, at the time, startup. I'd gotten through the recruiter screen and a hiring manager interview, and so far everything had seemed very normal. Lots of talk about their docs suite, docs as code, that kind of thing. Then they sent me the take-home assignment, and it was to code a simple Android app, and they wanted me to spend, quote, no more than 2 days on the task. Now, I probably don't have to tell the people in this room, but I'm not an Android developer. I was also, at the time, I was a single parent and I was studying part-time. So while I probably could have come up with something slightly passable after a full weekend of work, there was just no way in hell I was going to be doing that. So instead, I spent about an hour crafting a lengthy letter about why I wouldn't be doing their take-home task, how the skills they were asking for in their ad didn't match the skills they were testing for, and furthermore, why tests like this that required a significant amount of time tended to mean people in minorities self-select out of the process, which I then in no uncertain terms did. They did at least have the good grace to thank me for my time, which I appreciated.
The other main interview you'll find during this process is a values interview, and these can come in many, many guises. They could be called a scenario interview, a craft interview, a behavioural interview, or they could just say interview with no qualifier at all. Basically, this is the interview when you get asked, tell me about a time when, and then you need to answer with that ever-present star format. This is the interview that is hardest to nail, and it's probably the one that's hardest to be rejected over too, because you can just tie yourself up by knots, thinking about how you could have answered better, or had a different scenario, had a better example, or sounded more enthusiastic, or anything really. If you thought you needed to prepare for a technical interview, sadly, you need to over-prepare for this one. You need to have at least half a dozen good stories in your head that you can call up at a moment's notice, and you need to practice telling them in the proper star format so that you can just spout it out. You can find endless lists of example questions online, and we recommend going through each of those questions and coming up with an answer. And if you can, find a friend to practice with and encourage them to really pull apart your answers as much as they can. Even if the interviewer isn't really looking for stars, or if they haven't formatted their questions in the star format, answering it in stars is a really good idea. So practice those stars. Even if you don't know the format or the style of the view, it will help you.
Getting rejected at this stage hurts, and it's often the case that you don't know and can't find out what went wrong. I can safely say from when I was studying human resources practices at university that all the tools that companies have at their disposal to pick the best person for any job, including interviews, are at best a form of guano. They are literally flinging stuff at the wall to see what sticks. And that means that interviews like this are almost always going to end up with the interviewer saying something stupid like, I just didn't like them. Or, oh, they seemed nice. That we could absolutely go into detail about why our brains select candidates like this, but it's probably not the right conference or the right talk. So I'm happy to do that over a beer if anyone's interested. The point is, though, that we are all just monkeys in shoes, and all interviewing practices are terrible. Unfortunately, we're stuck with them.
So this is a story from a friend of ours, and they were interviewing for an open source organization, and they'd completed the entire interview process. They knew they were competing with one other person, and when they got rejected, they asked why. The answer was even though they were technically more proficient and had demonstrated their ability better than the other candidate, they went with the other candidate because they had a longer association with the community around the product. So in the end, technical skill didn't matter as much as familiarity.
Sometimes you can absolutely be the best candidate for the job. You could have nailed every single one of your interviews and the company loves you. You could even be working through salary negotiation, planning your start date and drafting that letter to your soon-to-be ex-boss when the rejection comes through. It's not you, they'll say. It's us. So let's talk about the rejections that come right when you least expect them.
So these rejections can really feel like they came right from outer space. You've probably been trying to keep a check on your hopes up to this point, but now it's starting to feel like you've really got this in the bag. While it's true that nothing is a done deal until the contract is signed, in most cases, once you've gotten into salary negotiation, all that fun stuff, it's actually pretty certain. So it's hard not to get excited at that point. However, this is the one rejection where you know it is not you, it's them. These types of rejections can come about because the company's entered a hiring freeze, there's a merger or an acquisition, there might be some problem in the company, or maybe financial priorities have changed there. If this happens to you, sadly, there's not a lot you can do here. You should be polite, thank everyone for their time. Everyone involved in their process put a lot of effort into this as well, so don't take it out on them. And they're all probably about as annoyed as you are. So, but keep a note about the company, and it's absolutely worth your time coming back to them if you see another good role advertised. And in some cases, you can even skip some of the interview stages if you've done it recently.
So this story comes from one of Steve's co-workers. He had applied to a role and interviewed strongly, was interested in the role, and the company was just about to extend an offer to him. The hiring manager had started the process of making an offer and were informed that the company was about to enter a hiring freeze, effective immediately. So the applicant ended up staying at his old job. He cooled his jets for about 12 months, all up, would you believe? And then when the role was advertised again, he reapplied. They made him go through the entire interview process all over again, but eventually the offer was made, no hiring freezes were announced, and he accepted the job.
Of course, not all rejections happen before you get the job, and sometimes they happen after you've worked there.
The first and most obvious one is getting fired. We didn't get any stories submitted to us on this topic, unsurprisingly, because it's not the kind of thing people like to talk about. And it's hard to give you advice on this as well, because each scenario is entirely different. All we can really say here is that if you get put on a performance improvement plan, or you're having those difficult pull your socks up kinds of conversations with your manager, probably start looking elsewhere. Once you've started down that road to being fired, it's almost impossible to get any kind of goodwill back, even if you are technically in the right. And if you are in the right, feel free to pursue that through whatever legal channels you have available, but probably don't make one of your conditions that the company needs to hire you back. It's not going to be fun for anyone involved, including you.
So this story is actually my own story. So over 2 decades ago, I was incredibly inexperienced, so I was working at a tiny ISP. when the authentication server stopped answering authentication queries, and we were drowning in customer calls because they couldn't connect to the internet. So I remotely cut the power to the authentication server, which happened to be in the middle of a consistency check. So I was fired on the spot. So I learned a lot about making unilateral, expensive decisions.
Of course, you don't have to only be on the receiving end of rejections. You also get to reject others. It's perfectly acceptable to decide that a company is no longer a good fit for you at any stage in the process. It doesn't matter if you're still interviewing, if you're on probation, or if you're a veteran. If you've decided that it's time to move on, go right ahead and do that. Always stay polite, never burn bridges, probably don't go out with a mariachi band and a banana suit, but don't be afraid to do what's right for you. It's really easy to think, oh, I'll finish up after this big release, or I can't leave now because they're short-staffed or whatever. But remember, that's their problem, not yours. If it's time for you to go, just go.
So this story comes from a Write the Docs community member, and they said, I decided I was not hardcore enough for the company at the time. And we'll leave it to an exercise for you to decide which company that may or may not have been.
Finally, although this talk is all about rejection, we hope that we've also given you a ray of hope.
And a lot of disco.
And a whole lot of disco. We are all the people we are because of the hard times that we've gone through. And every time you're rejected, you learn a little bit more and you get a little bit better. It's all about the journey.
So thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, rejections of your own, stories of your own, we're here for you.
Or if you'd like to reject us, that's cool too.
Thank you very much, Steve and Lana, for that quite entertaining exploration into the many different ways of recruitment foibles.
All the different ways you can be rejected.
That's right. It's quite the journey, isn't it? Right, folks.
Through disco.
Yeah, through disco. Yes, we've already got a question up. Right. So that was a really interesting question about candidate care when it goes right, not when it goes wrong. What have you learnt from those really good experiences on the flip side of that, and what can we take away from that?
One of the joys of being a manager who's hiring is you get to do more rejections than you do than you do the phone call saying, "Oh, hey, we'd like to give you a job." I don't know if I have any specific advice here other than sort of the thing we repeated a lot during that talk is just be polite. Make sure you realise that these are people's livelihoods that we're talking about. I think I think that's a good practice as a manager anyway, whether you're rejecting someone or otherwise, to be able to say, to be able to recognise that people come to work not because they love you or because, they love the work or whatever. They come because they want to get paid. Hopefully they do those other things as well, but they're there because they need to be paid. And it's really important to remember that people's livelihoods run on what we're doing and how we treat them. And we were talking about psychological safety earlier. I'm a big believer in psychological safety as a management practice as well. And I think it's just important to just remember that we're all human beings and to treat people as human beings. I think sometimes some of the nuance gets lost in the polite business conversation. Of I'm sorry, I can't accept you. You're not the one for us. And they all, no trouble. I understand. Thank you very much. And it's really hard to be able to do that.
How did you include so much disco imagery in your take-home assignment when we didn't even ask for that?
Yes. Sometimes it's hard to remember that there are people on the other side of this.
So the question was about sending a thank you note to I would imagine the question is about sending a thank you note to a company after you've gone through the process. What are your thoughts about doing the thank you note thing?
Don't do that after you've been fired.
Good advice, Steve.
I've not done that. The only level of thank you note I ever go to is the LinkedIn connection. I go and find the interviewer on LinkedIn. To be fair, I've probably already stalked them ahead of time, but if I, after the interview, I go and do the LinkedIn connection, I add a little note. Thanks for the chat last week. Had a good time. Looking forward to seeing you next week, whatever the line is. Just one or two lines. I don't tend to do the more formal ones. I have received one or two over the years, and I don't think it changed anything. For the record, I don't think it made me feel more or less favourable towards them, other than maybe going, oh, that's a bit odd. Like, that doesn't happen very often. But
Doesn't happen very often. Thank them for their time. Be polite, and then say, sorry, I couldn't take the opportunity, or
it might just make you feel worse if you
might
have
just
to
make
reject them.
It might just make you feel worse. So you may just want to wallow in the feelings instead.
To be honest, the things that stick in my memory of history of interviewing people are the really wild resumes that I've received, and the really wild calls. You'd ask a question about, say, Dox's code, and it's clear they know nothing about it, but they're going to talk for about 10, 15 minutes about something possibly not related. So those kinds of stories are the ones that stick in your head. Like I said, I'm sure I've received one or two thank you notes, but I can't imagine it would have shifted the needle at all.
The observation from the audience in was that after 50, you're mostly ignored, and that's a big problem with ageism and other discrimination forms, isn't it?
I've got 7 years to go, so.
Yep.
But I think we probably didn't. I don't think we mentioned it in the talk, and it's probably worth mentioning as well. Is there's always cultural differences. I'm coming at this as an Australian, obviously, who was educated in Australia.
We tried to fit it in, it didn't fit.
There was a whole lot of stuff that got cut out from that talk. I'm obviously coming this as an Australian who hires as an Australian using Australian business practices, and that's where my education is. But I've often been involved in, say, American companies or European companies, and the cultural differences are real, absolutely.
Great. Look, Steve, Lana, thank you so much for your time and the questions. Thank you, folks. Please thank Steve and Lana.